Waters Professor of History at Hampden-Sydney College, and also a great guy. He's written a terrific book called The French Revolution Begins, that's about the coming of age of the National Assembly, debates, discussions, the relationship with the king. It's tremendously interesting. And today, he's going to speak on a week in the life of a rumor in the early French Revolution.
Should I stay here?
It's up to you. I like to stand. Yeah.
Suzanne can't.
So my interest in the French Revolution is long-standing, but my interest in rumor and the mechanisms by which rumor spread is much more recent. It began when I wanted to know what happened after the royal session on the 23rd of June, 1789, during which Louis XVI had declared the creation and actions of the National Assembly null and void, and laid out a plan for the Estates General to favor the interests of the privileged orders. When the king dismissed the deputies and told them to resume work separately, by order the following day, members of the National Assembly stayed in their seats. They remained in the meeting hall for 3 or 4 hours, debating and deciding to stand behind all they had done. It was only about 3:30 in the afternoon that they left the hall. That much of what happened on the 23rd is well understood. I wanted to find out what happened next. The historians I consulted had come to very different conclusions, so I gathered all the sources I could and drew up my own account. As I understand it, the night before the meeting, word had leaked from the palace at Versailles that the Queen and the King's younger brothers had defeated the plan of the King's reforming minister, Jacques Necker, at the Royal Council. When the King's party and the deputies arrived at the main meeting hall late in the morning the next day, Necker was nowhere to be seen. His chair remained empty throughout the session. No public statement was made. No one seemed to know where Necker was. As the royal session ended around 11:30 in the morning, cheers of "Vive le roi" were heard by the crowd outside. As the king came out with his entourage, followed by most of the clerical deputies and all the notables, the crowd initially cheered as well. But when the Third Estate deputies failed to follow, it became clear something was wrong. Rumors swirled through the crowd that Necker had been dismissed or that he had resigned. When the remaining deputies left the building around 3:30, perhaps 200 of them walked a short distance to the Hôtel de Grand Contrôle, Necker's residence on the edge of the palace complex. The crowd followed. Necker's wife and daughter received a few of the deputies, but there was no further word about Necker's fate. For the next 2 hours, a mixed crowd milled outside the hotel, a crowd that included everyone from court aristocrats on down. Around 6 p.m., the Queen summoned Necker. He walked through the crowded street down to the palace, escorted by 200 Third Estate deputies, and followed by a crowd of perhaps 5,000 or 6,000 people. When Necker arrived at the main courtyard of the palace, he passed through the cordon of soldiers with his escort of deputies. Part of the crowd pushed through behind him, though they were prevented from entering the building itself. Necker and the deputies made their way to the Hall of Mirrors. From there, Necker went to meet with the Queen and after with the King. An hour passed before he resurfaced. As he left the hall, he spoke with a handful of courtiers and then exited the building through a side door into the courtyard, where he got into a carriage that took him home. Back at his residence, he told deputies at his salon he would stay on, and eventually went out on a balcony to say the same to the crowd. Despite his defeat on the night before and his absence from the royal session, Necker would stay in office. The whole show was over by 7:30 p.m. That's one version of what happened. One that relies on accounts from people who were in Versailles as the events unfolded. But as I pieced things together, I uncovered a different version that had its origins in Paris at the Palais Royal. The Palais Royal variant claimed that on the 23rd, the crowd outside the meeting hall, fearing that Necker had resigned or been dismissed, went directly to the palace after the meeting had ended. As the crowd milled menacingly in the courtyard, shouting out, "Vive Necker!" they were blocked from going into the palace by the soldiers on duty. Out of fear of the crowd, the king's younger brothers gave an order to fire on the people, but the soldiers disobeyed and put their guns on the ground. Terrified, the Queen summoned Necker, hoping he could defuse the situation, but Necker refused to come. Even when the king sent multiple summons, Necker refused, only agreeing when the deputies of the Third Estate assured him he had their support. After meeting with the king, Necker agreed to remain in office, but only on condition that Louis rescind everything he had done in the royal session This second version of events only appears in accounts originating in the Palais Royal and comes from sources that make no claim to being eyewitness. It occurred to me that the authors who had written these accounts were involved in the same endeavor I was. They were taking what they had learned about an event from others and trying to make it into a coherent narrative faithful to their sources. If I could learn more about how they had transformed their sources into a narrative, I could learn more about their biases. Not to correct them, not to find out what really happened, but to see the mental world the authors lived in, to learn more about their own ideas, commitments, hopes, and fears. Social scientists have puzzled over the stuff of rumor for more than a century, from Mark Bloch's work on how false news spread in World War I to recent investigations of rumor during the French Revolution. One way to think of rumor is to see it as the way a group of people try to come to an understanding of an important, ambiguous, and often threatening event. A curious feature of rumors is their tendency to change over time. Following on the work of Jean-Noël Captoret, we can say that the study of a story like ours is less about trying to find out what happened than of finding out what a group of people decided happened through a process of conversation and deliberation. Rumors are never transmitted in a simple fashion. Each transmission of a rumor involves an attempt to persuade the listener of its importance. A tells B a story, and B asks questions, tries to see if they understand what is being said. A and B work together toward a version of the story that makes sense to both of them. Then the process repeats. As the rumor spreads, it collects new details and explanations to make it more convincing. Ambiguity is eliminated, extraneous details vanish. What is left is a story that expresses not so much the truth of what happened, but a truth about what the community sharing the rumor desires, fears, or hopes. By looking at how a rumor changed over a few days in June 1789, we can get a sense of what the community that spread it was thinking, what it wanted, what it believed possible. I focus here on 6 written accounts that come from the murky underworld of writers congregated in and around the Palais Royal, about which Robert Martin has so convincingly written. All 6 appear in 4 days following the royal session, the 24th to the 28th of June. 3 are personal letters. 1 is a report from a secret agent to his employer. Another, a nouvelle à la main, and the last, a hastily written pamphlet. What ties them together is the claim that the king's decision to recall Necker was caused by the refusal of his soldiers to fire on a large crowd that had come to demand that Necker be kept in office. Across the accounts, we see the rumor change from a brief statement to a detailed explanation of who was involved, who did what, and what it all meant. It is in that progression from event to explanation that we get a furtive glimpse into the temper of the Palais Royal crowd in the run-up to the mid-July crisis of 1789. On the 24th of June, Nicolas Brouot, a former bookseller and a habitué of the Palais Royal, sent a brief account to his brother. In his version, things happen but are not explained. The crowd arrived in the evening, the princes cried to arms, the soldiers refused to fire their weapons. Necker showed up a little later and reassured the crowd he would stay on before speaking to the king. Afterwards, the king took a brief trip to a nearby palace, and throughout the night, people moved through Versailles praising Necker. There is no sense in the letter of how Brouot knows any of this, no sense of what it meant. Also on the 24th, an anonymous secret agent sent a report to his employer, almost certainly someone associated with one of the king's ministers. The agent wrote that he had been in Versailles until 7 p.m. and had seen no unrest himself. Hearing that Necker planned to leave, that there was trouble in Paris, the agent went to the Palais Royal and found all calm. He planted himself in the Café de Foix, the very nerve center of the Parisian information network, to see what he could learn. Around 11 p.m. he wrote, a police commissioner, still in his robes of office, appeared at the cafe and made a kind of formal announcement. The commissioner said there had been unrest in Versailles and a menacing crowd had gone to the palace earlier that evening. The princess had given soldiers an order to fire on it, but the men had not obeyed. The queen then sent for Necker, who had arrived escorted by 200 Thursday deputies. As cries of Vive Necker rang out from the courtyard, Necker met first with the queen and then the king. When Necker went home, the crowd followed, and someone had asked if he planned to stay on. Necker hesitated a moment, then said he would, and then told the crowd to be better behaved. The agent noted that the news was very well received in the Palais Royal, and that within minutes, someone announced that the king planned to revoke his orders of the 23rd of June. Here we see the bare facts turned into a story attributed to an official source. The story emphasized the power of the people. The queen summoned Necker only after the crowd had arrived and the soldiers refused to disperse it. Necker agreed to stay on and recognized that it was the people who had made it happen. That's why he scolded them. Most important, the agent reported the joy of the people in the Palais Royal upon hearing the news and their certainty that indicated the king's ill-advised plans of the 23rd of June had been given up. A third version, written on the 24th, found in the letter from Camille Desmoulins to his father, shows the rumor changing in real time as Desmoulins got more information. Early in the letter, Desmoulins gave a brief account, but later he wrote that he had just spoken to someone recently returned from Versailles, and he added more detail. Common to his two versions is the immense crowd in the palace courtyard and the notion that someone had, quote, really cried to arms without the soldiers moving, unquote. In both, Necker had been summoned out of fear. In the first version, though, it was fear of the crowd in the palace courtyard. In the second, in a new variant, the fear was inspired by a crowd gathering outside of Necker's residence, one that included many third estate deputies. Finally, both versions have Louis and Necker making a joint public statement at the end. If the previous accounts related fact and barely hinted at motives, Desmoulins gave the story drama. Rather than hinting at a reconciliation between the king and Necker, Desmoulins added a new detail: the joint appearance of the king and minister that showed it. In the earlier version, Necker appeared on a balcony with the king, quote, on his greatness, unquote. In the revised version, Louis and Necker exited their meeting holding hands and said to the deputies and notables assembled in the Hall of Mirrors that they would work together. Desmoulins' description of a joint appearance was a convincing declaration that Necker would stay on and that all was well. That neither joint appearance happened is beside the point. With his imaginative version of events, Desmoulins had answered the unspoken question: given that Necker is staying on, how can we know for certain that the king and Necker are reconciled? Our next account comes from the 27th of June. Like Desmoulins, this version is embellished with details that cannot be true, but that make the event easier to understand. The author, an anonymous noveliste allemand, answered important questions that might have arisen. He delved into the motivations of the participants. He explained why an order to fire on the crowd was given and provided a new detail to show that the soldiers had disobeyed the order. The novelist's account that the crowd arrived around 7 p.m. to tell the king not to listen, quote, to his family, to some greedy prelates, and to impostors, unquote. When the soldiers blocked the crowd in the courtyard, the soldiers, quote, stayed motionless in the face of their fellow citizens, unquote. The Count of Artois and Marie Antoinette then urged the king to order his soldiers to massacre the people. The Count of Artois, that confused the king, agreed and the order was given. But the soldiers refused to slaughter, the verb was égorger, to slaughter their fellow citizens and instead put their guns on the ground. Terrified, the king abandoned his decision to remake the royal council and summoned Necker. But Necker at first refused to come. Only at the urging of many deputies did Necker give in, but he refused to resume office until Louis had agreed to ignore the advice of, quote, ambitious men, unquote, and allow Necker to complete his work. By adding the detail that soldiers had put their guns on the ground, the noveliste removed ambiguity. Soldiers who put down their guns are disobeying an order. They are refusing to fire. In addition, this version showed Necker triumphant, making the king almost beg him to return to office, and with the king giving his word that he would listen only to Necker in the future. Again, that none of this had happened is beside the point. What we see here is a statement of desire, not of fact. This is a depiction of what should have happened, not of what did. The additional details, the imagined conversation inside the chateau, the soldiers putting down their guns, lay out clearly what the event means. The people united overawed the court and made the confused but good-hearted king bring back Necker. This version shows that people had real power to influence events. The need to explain the motivations of the participants caused a fork in the rumor. The last two versions we examined here give different explanations for why the order to fire was given, and both expand on the soldiers' refusal to obey. They both also appear at a different time than the before versions we just heard. In a brief pamphlet published on the 25th or 26th of June, the author emphasized the anger of the people who had gathered outside of the chateau and the patriotism of the soldiers who had refused orders. According to the pamphlet, as soon as the people heard what the king had proclaimed in the royal session, they rushed to the palace, surrounded it, and behaved in a menacing way. It was only around 11 p.m., after the standoff in the courtyard had gone on for many hours, after the sun had gone down, the princes came out of the palace and gave the order to fire. The soldiers, here identified for the first time as men from the French and Swiss guards, refused the order to fire because they identified with the people, not with the princes. Given the order to fire, they instead put their guns on the ground in a clear sign of disobedience. The added details in the pamphlet made the situation at the palace appear much more threatening. The chateau had been surrounded for hours. The sun had gone down. That a crowd could hardly surround the chateau at Versailles is irrelevant. What mattered was the fear the assembled people inspired in the court. Necker was returned to office because the court was afraid of the people. And according to this pamphlet, on the morning of the 24th, the king agreed to rescind the entire platform of the 23rd. The power of the people to influence events could not have been made more clearly. Our final version was recounted by the Parisian lawyer Hampden-Sydney in a letter of the 28th of June to a friend living in the provinces. Colson claimed that events in the palace had unfolded only after the sun had set. According to Colson, the people in Versailles had been upset by the outcome of the royal session, but it was not until 11 p.m. that the crowd gathered at the chateau. Rattled by the sudden appearance of a torch-wielding mob, the officers on duty cried out, "To arms!" but the soldiers did not obey. On the third time the order was given, the soldiers put their guns on the ground. Frightened by this turn of events, Marie Antoinette summoned Necker, who refused to come. Only after the king had asked him multiple times did Necker comply. Even then, Necker refused the king's request that he take up office. Only when the king promised to revoke what he had ordered at the royal session, Necker finally agreed. Having secured the king's promise, Necker was carried back to his residence in triumph. In this final version, the king's brothers are absent. The appearance of a menacing crowd after dark, combined with the soldiers' repeated refusal to obey orders, compelled the royal couple to reinstate Necker. Again, we hear that Necker used the situation to his advantage, refusing to resume his office unless Louis voided his actions on the 23rd. This did not happen. It expressed a desire, not a reality. But it also expressed a possibility that the people could force the king to change his mind. Here we must pause. You've heard how the progress of the rumor in the Palais Royal took a simple account of events at Versailles and turned it into an elaborate story of the people's triumph over conservatives at court. By examining a rumor as it shifted in content, we have seen that elements related to the power of the people to control events became ever sharper. Through their resolute action, the people had forced the king to reinstate Necker and to promise to listen to his advice. According to this rumor, after the disastrous royal session, the people had saved Necker and with him the revolution. Discussions of rumor during the French Revolution have long focused on rumors that express fear and dread. Here we see something different, a rumor that expressed hope and optimism and expressed the belief that the people could protect Necker. The creation through rumor of this optimistic narrative undoubtedly influenced activists in the Palais Royal to take matters into their own hands. Within days, a crowd originating in the Palais Royal stormed a royal prison to free soldiers allegedly involved in the events of the 23rd. Within weeks, the people would march in support of Necker, again dismissed, in the knowledge that the last time it had happened, they had forced the king to change his mind. Through rumor, the idea that the people had the power to change events had become a self-fulfilling prophecy.
We're off to a great start. Our next speaker will be Tom Kaiser, who is Professor Emeritus from the University of Arkansas, but also is now teaching at the University of Maryland. So we all know that he has edited important books on conspiracy in the French Revolution, the origins of the French Revolution, But did you know that he edited a book on environmental history long before it was cool? He's also written, as many of us have read, terrific articles about the old regime economy, diplomacy, Marie Antoinette. He knows tons about Franco-Austrian relations. He's well positioned to give a paper entitled Rumors and Foreign Plots from the Fall of the Bastille to the March on Versailles.
Thanks so much, Suzanne. On the morning of 28 July, 1789, the Marquise de la Tour-du-Pin, daughter-in-law to the Minister of War, left her residence in Forges-les-Eaux, Normandy, where she found a crowd outside crying and throwing up their hands in despair. The reason? A disheveled horseman, she was told, had just ridden through the town, warning that a contingent of Austrian troops were about to arrive and set fire to the entire region. Not easily fooled, the Marquise pointed out that such an attack was hardly likely, since France and Austria were not at war, and even if such an attack were about to occur, the town would have received a much earlier warning. Alas, neither argument convinced the panicky good people of Forges. So to extinguish all worries by means of a personal investigation, she, the Marquise, her husband, and their English groom, who thought Frenchmen were crazy, trotted off to nearby Fontaine, where the Austrians were supposedly bivouacked and reconnoitered the area. Needless to say, they found no trace whatsoever of Austrian troops. What they did find were alarmed villagers who had apparently been misinformed by the same disheveled horsemen passing through Forges, and who wanted to desperately know and asked the Marquise whether any Austrian troops had been sighted in Forges. After learning much to their relief that this was not the case, the villagers calmed down. But matters did not stop there. Stirred by images of Austrian aggression, one man went so far as to accuse the Marquise herself of being the Austrian-born Queen Marie Antoinette, presumably on site to abet the Austrian attack, and on that pretext the Marquise was detained. But not for long, since one young locksmith came to her rescue by reassuring everyone that having seen the true queen in Versailles 2 months earlier, he could testify that she was at least twice as old and twice as fat as the Marquise. This was sufficient for the Marquise to regain her liberty, at which point she and her party returned late in the day to Forges. No harm had come to them, yet on their arrival they found that the townsmen there, still haunted by phantom Austrians, had construed the delay in their return as a sign of their imprisonment by the invaders. Thus ends my little story. So what can we learn from it? And more specifically, how can we account for this rumor-driven behavior? To begin with, and to underscore the point, no country, including Austria, had active plans to invade France at this moment. Or as Tim Blanding has unambiguously put it, there was no threat from the old regime powers, period. Why then, the citizens of central Normandy, some 150 miles from the closest Austrian border, imagined they would be attacked from that point in peacetime is something of a mystery. One clue may lie in the fact that the great fear was sweeping parts of France at this moment, and crop burning was on the minds of Normans, as it was the residents of other regions. Even more to the point, the brigands allegedly responsible for it, as Clay Ramsey and Timothy Tackett have shown, came in various shapes and sizes, and not all were imagined to be the running dogs of the aristocracy. Indeed, as Donald Sutherland has argued, quote, fear of brigands easily slid into fears of foreign invasion, unquote. And this is what appears to have happened in central Normandy. In the balance of my paper, I should like to demonstrate why this was the case. Far from being exceptional, I shall argue, rumors of foreign plots, long before the famous foreign plot of the Terror, were commonplace by the summer of 1789, and moreover played palpable roles at the outbreak of the French Revolution that historians who have understandably focused more on domestic matters have not sufficiently recognized. First, a little context. As diplomatic historians, myself included, have shown, France's standing among the great powers had plummeted by 1789, mostly immediately in reaction to its failure to support its Dutch ally against the Prussian invasion and its abandonment of its old friend Turkey during its war with Russia. Confidence in France's inability to defend its interests translated into acknowledgement of its weakness by, among others, the Austrian Emperor Joseph II, who by 1789 was caustically dismissing France as a nullity, his word, among the great powers. Thus, although none of them planned to invade France in 1789, there were many warnings that such might be the case. In that event, how prepared was France to meet the threat? And in a word, it was poorly placed. After years of failing to put its financial house in order, the French state was suffering from steeply declining revenues, exacerbated by tax avoidance, which by 1789 had left a mere 12 million livres in the treasury, and obliged Necker to propose reductions in the War Department of some 15 to 20 million livres. Stricken further by lackluster recruitment, serious morale problems, and perhaps worst of all, the questionable loyalty of some units, the French army shrank to only half the size of the Austrian and Russian armies, prompting the war minister to lament in August that he lacked the necessary forces to keep order at home, let alone wage war abroad, which he dared not even mention. In short, the citizens of Forges and Fontaine, they had been deluded about an imminent invasion, but they had legitimate reasons to worry about French vulnerability generally. From where did the French imagine the foreign threats were coming? Seemingly from all corners of Europe. As one pamphlet put it in July, 60,000 brigands were thought to be descending on France, quote, from everywhere, unquote, to increase disorder and interrupt the operations of the National Assembly. Similarly, in August, there were rumors of an imminent invasion by 40,000 Spanish troops to secure the monarchy, and of the even more highly improbable deployment of 15,000 Turkish soldiers to rescue the Queen and provide her with asylum. However, of all the suspect powers, it was Britain and Austria that headed the list. Already in June, rumors of a British plot to force the surrender of French naval shipyards in Brest had been so pervasive and compelling that French officers suspected of collusion had defected to escape retribution. Despite the efforts of the British ambassador Dorset to quash these rumors, similar ones continued to surface, among them the story of a British plot to incinerate the Brest arsenal that had been barely foiled. Nor had the British allegedly stopped at attacking French military installations. It was now widely believed, Dorset reported, that British agents were fomenting disorder in Paris and were responsible for igniting the mob on 14 July through direct subsidies. While allegedly causing trouble on that front, the British were also suspected of colluding with counter-revolutionaries, notably the Comte d'Artois, thereby fomenting chaos by pitching both parties against one another. Rumors like these rippled through the National Assembly and other government agencies. This fact needs stressing in part because it shows that rumors of foreign plots were taken seriously, not only by the popular classes, but also by the well-born and well-educated. Among them, notably the worldly Lafayette, who suspected that behind the machinations of his adversaries, notably the Duc d'Orléans, there lurked and these are his words, an invisible hand of an infernal cabal that appears to be fueled by foreigners. Likewise, the French ambassador to Britain, Lucerne, notwithstanding Dorset's denials of British subversion, was convinced that Dorset's prediction of defections in the French army proved that Britain was party, quote, to this intrigue, unquote. Another point to stress is that these rumors, far from mere political status on the surface of the revolution, had a direct impact on its course. Hence, for example, it was after the Marquis de Guy d'Arcy, among others, had denounced the so-called conspiracy of Brest and cited it as proof positive that, quote, all nations are conspiring against the happiness of France, unquote, that the National Assembly proceeded to establish the Comité de Recherche, charged with collecting intelligence on conspiracies of all sorts and other forms of subversion. Not surprisingly, the fears of Austrian subversion centered on the Queen and her creatures. As the Austrian ambassador, reported to Joseph on 23 July, rumors of vast sums of money she was allegedly funneling to Vienna were metastasizing and engendering, quote, other similar ideas. unquote, notably the notion that an imperial army was about to attack France, a threat that Comité de Moulins was then echoing in the Palais Royal. Not only were such ideas, quote, making a profound impression on the people, Merci despaired, they were also accepted at face value by, quote, those sorts of persons who should be embarrassed by them, unquote. As a result, both the Queen and Merci became a target of death threats in the summer of 1789, their names having appeared on such notorious prescription lists as the Chasse aux bêtes puantes et féroces, which placed bounties of 40,000 and 30,000 livres, respectively, on their heads. Rumors alleging that in the wake of 14 July, the Queen had fled Versailles and taken asylum in Merci's Paris residence generated a host of threats to burn it down, forcing him to flee. His residence was not incinerated in the end, but in blatant violation of Merci's diplomatic immunity, a constant guard was posted around it to intercept all communications with the Queen, while his residence and his coach were periodically searched for munitions that might be used for nefarious purposes. Over the summer of and early fall of 1789, such fears, far from abating, intensified. Part of the reason was that after performing miserably in the Russo-Turkish War that it had joined in early 1788, Austria began winning on the battlefield. This shift in the tides of war was enough to prompt de Moulins and some radical journalists to claim, falsely, that Joseph had already made a peace with the Turks and was ready, quote, to send his forces against us, unquote. The Queen and the King, de Moulins maintained, were preparing to emigrate to foster Joseph's efforts, a claim that echoed many others alleging that the royal family intended to flee Versailles and lead a counter-revolutionary force from elsewhere. Preemption of that flight by forcing the royal family to relocate to Paris now became one of the most persistent demands of Parisian radicals and the crowd. At the very least, de Moulins insisted, the Queen had to be incarcerated in the convent of Saint-Cyr and the Dauphin held as hostage. Further exacerbating patriot worries was the rightward shift of the monarchy and its allies in the Assembly, who, as Timothy Tackett has shown, were gaining strength at the moment. It also enacted a royal suspensive veto that the crowd not incorrectly interpreted as a powerful weapon the king might use for nefarious purposes. But if the left had its worries, so did the center right. On 30 August, in a prequel of 5-6 October, a demonstration erupted in the Palais Royal, demanding the relocation of the royal family to Paris. A demonstration that, while easily suppressed by the National Guard, prompted an agonizing reappraisal of existing defenses in Versailles by royal authorities. The decision, in which the Queen participated, to reinforce those defenses by calling in the Flanders Regiment inflamed sentiment on the left, which saw it as a repeat of Du Bois' notorious troop deployment in Paris on the eve of 14 July, and further evidence of a second counter-revolutionary coup that threatened to uproot everything the revolution had accomplished. Heightening these concerns was the somewhat mysterious mushrooming of black cockades around Paris. Cockade wearing was ubiquitous in Europe at this time. Each country and military unit had its own set. In France, a new patriotic tricolor cockade had been designed, apparently by Lafayette, which the nation had adopted in the words of the Paris Communal Assembly as the symbol of liberty and unity. Not wearing one on appropriate occasions could make you appear suspiciously unpatriotic, but wearing another cockade invited worse suspicions. White cockades, which, for example, were standard issue for the king's bodyguards, indicated a likely misplaced loyalty to the Bourbon monarchy. Black cockades were somewhat more ambiguous in their signification, but they were, if anything, more suspect because of their association with the House of Austria, France's dubious ally, whose troops wore a cockade featuring a large black imperial eagle. Thus did the radical journalist Jean-Louis Carrat explicitly label the black cockade the Austrian cockade, mere display of which, he warned, could transform you into a veritable Austrian slave. We can now appreciate why an apparent proliferation of black cockades in the run-up to 5-6 October generated as much fear and outrage as it did, especially after they were widely rumored to have been distributed by the Queen's ladies-in-waiting to National Guardsmen, the Flanders Regiment, and the King's bodyguards in the notorious orgy banquet of 1 October. Part of that outrage stemmed from reports that sacred national cockades had been desecrated, while some accounts alleged that the cockades dispersed by the Queen's creatures had been white. But other reports, probably a majority, asserted that they had been black. At this fraught moment, this was enough to raise the specter of a counter-revolutionary coup spreading its tentacles into the far reaches of the French state, notably the military, abetted by the Austrian-born Queen with the support of Joseph and his slaves in France. As the journal Révolution de Paris configured it, the orgy of 1 October had unleashed, quote, everything that could be done to energize the soldiers in giving a baneful example to the rest of the army. In other words, to transform the entire French army into a tool of the counter-revolution. This had been done, explained the journal Courrier de Versailles, by means of scripted appearances of the royal family at the orgy, which had focused the attention of the National Guards on their duties to the king, not to the nation. Ladies of the court had then showered them with, quote, cockades not of the patrie, that would ultimately be used, immediately be adopted, quote, by all the regiments in France, upon learning that, quote, this cockade had been adopted at a military festival which the king had honored with his presence. The final goal was to have it, quote, adopted like all those discontented with the present regime by the traitors among us. Worst of all, this process appeared to be well underway, as evidenced by the mushrooming of black cockades in many places, including the Place du Louvre, the Luxembourg Gardens, and the Palais Royal. To be sure, those foolhardily enough to wear the black cockade in public risked and in many cases received proper canings and other punishments from patriot crowds to prevent them from inciting, in the words of the Marquis de Ferrières, a civil war given time to multiply. Yet in a report of one such incident, the Révolution de Paris held out little hope that this could be avoided. Rather, it raised the prospect of an endless proliferation of monocolored cockades among various sectors of the population that made civil war seem almost inevitable. Haunted by the same vision, the Paris Communal Assembly responded on 4 October to the alleged desecration of national cockades and the replacement by Blackman's at the Versailles orgy by banning the display of all the patriotic cockade. In the end, this measure amounted to too little and came too late to prevent the Parisian crowd from seizing the initiative on 5 October and storming the Hôtel de Ville on its way to marching to Versailles. What the above helps to explain is why what seems to have started out as a bread riot so quickly and with virtually no coaching exploded into a political insurgency that ended in an assault on the Versailles Palace, the Queen's near assassination, and the forced relocation of the royal family to Paris. Granted, securing food was a hungry crowd's most urgent priority. But when on 5 October, Stanislas Marie Maillard presented the demands of the crowd to the National Assembly, he told the deputies that the people had come to Paris not only to ask for bread, but also to punish the king's bodyguards for insulting the patriotic cockade, and warned them that calm could be restored and further misfortune prevented only by requiring them to wear one. He then dramatically pulled from his pocket one of the black cockades that the crowd had violently seized from a helpless victim in Paris and en route to Versailles, declaring that he would now have the pleasure of tearing it to pieces, which he proceeded to do. That act, I submit, was intended not only to compensate for the insult delivered to the new nation at the Versailles orgy. It was a symbolic and presumptively efficacious first step towards diffusing a counter-revolution backed by aristocrats and hostile foreign powers like Austria. A plot whose undoing could only be guaranteed by the forced removal of the royal family of Paris, where the people could maintain a jealous guard over their sovereign. Let me conclude with a very, very short anecdote, followed just by very few brief comments. Here's the anecdote. When walking one day through the Palais Royal in October 1789, a certain aristocrat was approached by a hawker of pamphlets who proposed selling him one entitled, quote, "The Departure of a Traitor from the National Assembly, the Marquis de Blackman, Deputy from Dauphiné." "Are you sure the Marquis has truly departed?" asked the aristocrat. "Yes, of course, monsieur," the hawker answered. "Just read the pamphlet." "Really? Really," replied the aristocrat, "because I happen to be the departed traitor." Now, it has been cynically said that rumors are accepted by idiots. A proposition with which the Marquis of Blackman would undoubtedly have agreed. Yet it also needs to be said that in the age of the French Revolution, rumors transmitted orally and textually were perfectly natural forms of communication, given that virtually all supposedly authoritative sources of information were contested, and the unprecedented, constantly changing circumstances in which the French found themselves. In that respect, it is a fair guess that more than quashing rumors and discrediting misinformation, the explosion of print media gave them a new lease on life and a wider circulation. Foreign meddling in French affairs was especially susceptible to rumor mongering at a time when the nation's defenses were slowly disintegrating and the nation was less able to repel a foreign attack than at any time since the 30 Years' War. To be sure, there was a disconnect between the plans of foreign powers, including Austria, and what the French suspected they were up to, including nefarious meddling in French politics through the Queen and other agents. At the same time, political fantasies, such as the belief that Austrian forces were camped just down the road from Forges, preparing to set fire to the entire region, were not entirely untethered from reality. France had lost its stature among the great powers. Emigrant princes were petitioning foreign rulers to invade France and put down the revolution, and those foreign rulers, while dismissive of those efforts, were already fretting about the baneful subversive effects of the French Revolution on their own subjects. Indeed, I would conclude that it was precisely because elements of truth blended so neatly with fantasies that rumors of foreign invasion in this period were so credible.
Next we'll hear from Victoria Thompson, who this fall made the bold move of moving to become the chair of History and Sociology at Georgia Tech. She has 2 books forthcoming. One of them, the title is Moving So Fast I Have to Get It on This Piece of Paper Moments Ago, Royal Urbanism and Public Space in Pre-Revolutionary Paris, La Place Mupin's 1748 to 1789. She has another book also coming out, a collection of essays in honor of someone in this room, Lynn Hunt. Yes. And that's called Everyday Politics and Culture in Revolutionary France. Okay. Oh, Victoria, let me read your paper title, sorry. Rumor and the Right of Assembly, the National Assembly Comes to Paris.
Thank
And in
you.
fact, Suzanne is also one of the editors.
Well, I was just going to say, what Suzanne will say is that it's actually co-edited with Suzanne and with Jim Reagan.
No team.
Very fun project. And it's authors in this room. So. Okay. On October 19, 1789, the National Assembly met in Paris for the first time in the Archbishop's Palace next to Notre Dame. Many had been dreading this day, when the deputies would be in the midst of the people of Paris. It was not only accounts of violence in the capital that worried the deputies, it was also rumors of violence against themselves, which had been frequently evoked in debates after the October days. Mirabeau captured both the danger deputies perceived and their need for resolve in a speech to the Assembly. Quote, surrounded by cruel fears, still one must, in the midst of such great challenges, display a serene manner and always remain calm. This exhortation to remain calm in the face of danger was not new in October. In June, during the standoff between the king and the Third Estate, as troops massed in Versailles and Paris, deputies also had to face their fears and steel their resolve. However, after the October days, as deputies contemplated a move to Paris, rumors of violence in legislative debates revealed deputies' fears not only for their personal safety, but also for the continued legitimacy of the National Assembly. These rumors both weakened the Assembly and paradoxically contributed to the articulation of a shared identity. These rumors also reveal a partial shift in attitudes toward armed force and its relationship to popular violence. Historians have shown that popular unrest in the capital shaped legislative debates and actions from the outset of the revolution. Blackman, for example, argues that in addition to the violence of the Great Fear, the murder of royal officials Coulon and Berthier contributed to deputies' decision to renounce their privileges and dismantle feudalism in the hope of ending popular unrest. As the summer progressed, reports of popular violence hastened deputies' resolve to formulate the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen and influence decision-making on the suspensive veto. The October days, as Suzanne Desan wrote, quote, deepened deputies' concern about street politics. And the fear that deputies felt during the October days, followed on October 21st by the lynching of Parisian baker Denis Francois, drove the Assembly to pass a martial law. There's no doubt that, as Colin Lucas argued, the period between July 14th and late October challenged political elites to distinguish between violence that furthered the revolution and violence that threatened to undermine it. Examining rumors of popular violence in legislative debates allows us to explore in more detail the complex functions of popular unrest in the evolution of the National Assembly during the early months of the revolution. Research has shown that rumors tend to take hold at the intersection of familiar frameworks of understanding and new information that does not fit these frameworks. During the summer of 1789, deputies had to rethink their view of both popular violence and of armed force, as frameworks established in the old regime no longer fit the facts on the ground. Research has also shown that rumors can perform a useful function within groups experiencing threats to their status, as the National Assembly certainly was during the summer and fall. And they fulfill this function by strengthening a commitment to shared values. However, the use of rumor to assert shared values contributes to a tendency to treat rumor as fact. Looking closely at how deputies use rumors of violence against themselves reveals that old frameworks for understanding the relationship of the people to armed force were challenged by threats of violence against the deputies, making martial law more palatable, even while deputies sought to preserve the right of the people to air grievances. In late June and early July 1789, as Louis XVI increased troop presence in and around Paris and Versailles, deputies in the nascent National Assembly argued that armed force fueled popular unrest, drawing on old regime examples. In a debate on July 13th, the Count de Versailles recalled the summer of 1788, when royal efforts to replace the parliaments with a new judicial system coincided with high bread prices, political instability, and a financial crisis. Widespread unrest in Paris was met with an ever-increasing number of soldiers in the capital. For Versailles, the lesson from this period was clear. Quote, the troops were withdrawn and all returned to order. And as in pre-revolutionary crises involving contests between the crown and parliament, amassing troops in and around Paris was seen as evidence of ministerial despotism. On July 15th, the Marquis de Sillery denounced the influence of cool advisors, stating that the French, quote, adore their kings but never want to fear them. He commented that if royal troops had been withdrawn earlier in July 1789, the excess of fury in Paris on the 14th would have been avoided. The deputies voted unanimously to send a delegation to the king, asking him to withdraw the troops, which he did immediately for that day. The belief that our force would create rather than quell popular unrest was a continuation of old regime frameworks of understanding, in which the people were not to blame for violence that resulted from bad decisions made by the king. Without bad advisors, deputies reasoned, the king would demonstrate his love for his people by adopting policies that benefited them, and the people would no longer need to rebel. Following the brutal murders of Salon and Versailles on July 22nd, members once again argued that troops would not stop popular violence, but put a new emphasis on legislation and state building, arguing that the people needed clear laws and a court that could try those few who had committed crimes against them. Similarly, on August 9th, the Assembly voted to print and disseminate the decrees of August 4th in order to stop the continued violence throughout France. In early September and again on October 2nd, delegations from the Paris Commune reinforced deputies' faith in laws and institutions by requesting that the Assembly pass a law concerning public disorder and identify a court in which to try the guilty. Deputies deferred the question of judicial reform to after the Constitution was written and expressed frustration that the decrees of August 4th and those concerning the free circulation of grains were not being printed and disseminated. They believed that the people would be calm if only they knew what the National Assembly had accomplished in their name. Deputies' great concern when 1,000 infantry were called to Versailles in late September, as well as their consternation about the presence of the Flanders Regiment in Versailles, suggests that they still considered using troops to dispel menacing or violent crowds a tool of despotism. Within this framework of understanding, the people threatened violence only out of ignorance of the law, while the fear of violence that deputies experienced was real during the summer. They had a framework for understanding it that reinforced their belief that legislation and state building would restore order. The events of October 5th and 6th upset this framework. While individual deputies had recounted their fear of popular violence throughout the summer in letters and diaries, it was only after the October days that rumors of violence directed against the Assembly entered in a meaningful way into political debates. On July 31st, for example, as conspirators in the Palais Royal threatened violence, the concern of many deputies was quickly dismissed as needing no further debate. The October days were different. Suzanne Desan's rich analysis of the invasion of the meeting hall by Parisians underscores the enormous impact of this event on deputies. In the days that followed, many deputies recounted threats of violence. These threats, many of which were rumors, were central to debates about the continued legitimacy of the National Assembly and were recounted in the Assembly only after deputies learned on October 8th that they must move to Paris. On the morning of October 6th, as deputies contemplated rumors that the king might move to Paris or to another location, they unanimously approved a motion declaring the king and the National Assembly inseparable. Almost immediately afterward, deputies learned that the king was going to Paris, and on October 8th, they were informed that he expected the Assembly to follow. This confirmation of the move to the capital was part of a discussion concerning the National Assembly's relationship to the crown as well as its own continued legitimacy. First, fears of personal danger led some deputies to call into question whether the Assembly really needed to go to Paris. Two deputies presented conflicting interpretations of what they saw and heard on October 6th as they accompanied the king to the capital. Dufresne, Duchy, and Goupil de Prézel were both part of the delegation that accompanied the king from Versailles to Paris, and both reported encountering a crowd that threatened members of the Assembly. The latter, however, also reported that he heard that all honnête hommes repudiated such threats, but other deputies immediately chimed in, contributing rumors of violence against the deputies that they had heard. The Abbé Gregoire stated that a day doesn't pass without deputies being insulted in Paris, and Monsieur de Montpensier reported that even in Versailles, the Assembly was insulted by the crowd. The Assembly reaffirmed its intention to move to Paris at the end of this discussion, but only after several deputies stated that they really didn't have to go. This debate revealed how deputies' fears impacted their view of the relationship between the king and the Assembly. The following day, the question of threats was raised again, with a different member reporting that on the way to October 6th, a different crowd informed him of a list of proscribed deputies who would soon be facing popular vengeance. Malouet next took the podium, stated that he had been, quote, insulted, menaced, and pursued. He argued that libelous slanders and popular threats threatened free debate within the Assembly. Custine responded by stating that libelous threats could and should be ignored, but popular demonstrations, or attroupements, could not. The discussion continued that evening with the deputy recounting how he defended himself from the crowd with his umbrella. Diego questioned whether or not anyone was really in danger, while Bouteville-Dunetz argued that deputies, quote, exaggerated reports of danger. This debate ended when representatives of the Paris Commune entered, pleading with the deputies to come to Paris to restore order. These discussions on October 8th and 9th are interesting for the way in which deputies mixed accounts of actual experiences with what they heard from others. To us, in this room at least, these appear to be two different rhetorical strategies, one based on the facts of lived experience and the other on rumor. However, this strict separation between fact and supposition doesn't capture the ways in which individuals could recount experiences to achieve different ends, as we see in the exchange between Dufresne, Duchy, and de Prézel, nor the role of exaggeration in debate. In addition, rumor was considered a valid source of information in the 18th century. Paying attention to rumors was a useful practice in a regime where political decision-making was the secret of the king and political maneuvering occurred at court. In the Assembly's discussion, rumors united diverse topics: fears of personal danger, the legitimacy of the Assembly, and its relationship to the Crown. In addition, this discussion revealed cracks in the belief that good legislation maintains order. When one deputy demanded that the Assembly pass a decree guaranteeing their safety, another replied that legislation can't protect you from someone determined to do you bodily harm. Threats of violence were interwoven in this discussion with the topic of issuing passports to deputies who wish to return home. Deputies in this debate, deputies moved back and forth between these topics in a way that made clear that rumors of violence were weakening the National Assembly. On October 9th, for example, a member raised the question of whether the President of the National Assembly was authorized to issue passports. This immediately gave way to more debate about whether it was necessary or even possible to guarantee the safety of deputies. When one member demanded that the Assembly forbid anyone from insulting the clergy, another responded, quote, "The terror of the clergy is a terror based on panic rather than reality." Mirabeau argued that spoken or written threats were just words, quote, "An honest man doesn't pay attention to them." Those who discounted threats of violence as rumor took the position that deputies needed to remain in place and stay steadfast. Those who presented the violence as real called for the Assembly to guarantee the safety of its members and asserted the right of deputies to return home. Mirabeau, citing the issuance of 300 passports in 2 days, raised the possibility that fear might lead the Assembly to lose so many of its members that it lost its legitimacy. On October 11th, Martineau started out the discussions of that day with a clear declaration. Passports will, quote, "lead to the dissolution of the Assembly, and if it dissolves, the state dissolves as well." Now, Parisians, of course, knew that the deputies were afraid. On October 10th, for example, the journal Révolution de Paris reported that deputies let their fears be seen about the impending move to Paris. Goupil de Prézin was one who called into question this obligation, stating that deputies passed the decree on the separability of the king and assembly before they knew that this meant moving to the capital, so it seemed as if there might be some legal loophole there. In response to these discussions, on October 10th, the Commune sent a deputation to convince deputies that they would be safe in the capital. Apparently convinced, at least for the moment, the Assembly dropped the discussion of whether or not its members would be in danger in Paris. However, on October 14th, just 5 days before they opened the session in Paris, Mirabeau introduced a project for martial law based on the English Riot Acts. Previous calls for martial law in late July and late August had been quickly dismissed, and Mirabeau's proposal was passed on to a committee for discussion. This project, which, along with a similar proposal by Troget, served as the basis for a martial law passed on October 21st, demonstrates that while deputies were afraid, they were also reluctant to use force against the people. They still believed that the majority of the people would remain peaceful if the laws were explained to them and the Assembly was responsive to their needs. Thus, in the project for martial law, in the case of popular demonstration, officials were to give the crowd 2 chances to send delegates to a municipal or state official before troops could be used to disperse it. Mirabeau's belief that those with legitimate grievances could be distinguished from troublemakers was a slight modification of the view of the people in mid-July. It preserved the faith in the just indignation of a people who had suffered the yoke of despotism, while shifting blame for unrest from despotic ministers onto malcontents who spread rumors to stir up trouble. As deputies continued to discuss martial law and the move to Paris, we see a turning point from threats of violence to assertions of bravery. On October 10th, Martineau opened the debate on passports by denouncing malcontents and calling on the courage of the deputies to stay in their place. Quote, "Stay here. It is only here that we can save the state." Moved by his call to courage and the concerns over the hundreds of deputies who had left the Assembly, the Assembly voted to limit the time deputies could be absent. Similarly, to argue that outside access to the floor of the Assembly, once they moved to Paris, should be limited, the Duc d'Aiguillon asserted, quote, "You, deputies, have marched through dangers." And on October 19th, the Assembly's first day in Paris, Mirabeau evoked the many dangers Bailly and Lafayette had faced, depicting them as heroes who remained calm and steadfast in the face of adversity. This strategy shored up the resolve of deputies to remain in the Assembly, but it also granted legitimacy to rumors of violence that only a few days ago Mirabeau had been discounting as unimportant. Without this legitimacy to these rumors of violence, deputies, however, could not be enjoined to display courage. Whereas in the immediate aftermath of the October days, rumors of violence revealed a crisis of legitimacy in the Assembly, this new formulation of deputies' courage seemed to unite them, at least momentarily. Contemporaries viewed the passage of martial law on October 21st as a response to the lynching of the baker Denis Francois. However, while the Assembly passed the law at the request of the Paris Commune, powerful voices argued that armed force was not the answer. The answer was bread. As Mirabeau asked rhetorically, quote, "When the crowd of people cried, 'The baker has no bread,' what monster would respond with rifle shots?" Indeed, in the immediate aftermath of the October days, the passage of martial law was not an urgent matter of business. Instead, deputies urgently sought to reconfirm their legitimacy by articulating a shared commitment to writing a constitution, come what may, and by reasserting the abilities of the deputies to distinguish between good and bad actors. The project of martial law presented to the Assembly did this by creating a process by which legitimate grievances could be registered. That, it was hoped, would be enough to restore order. If not, troops could legitimately be used to disperse those who sought to derail the revolutionary project. In conclusion, the October days upset a framework of understanding inherited from the old regime, by which the National Assembly and the people as a whole were united against a despotism that revealed itself in the deployment of soldiers. After the October days, deputies desperately sought to craft a new framework to understand events. Deputies' courage in the face of violence, the belief in the validity of legal and institutional means to prevent violence, and the assertion that force would only be necessary against troublemakers remained important elements of revolutionary political culture. However, the calm that followed a few days of panicked debate in the Assembly was short-lived. On November 9th, the National Assembly moved from the Archevêché to the Manège. Closer to both the king and the crowd, deputies faced new challenges to their safety, their identities, and their political beliefs.
Our comment today will be from Jarvis, who is Associate Professor at the University of Notre Dame. But before this affiliation with the Fighting Irish, she was, of course, a Badger at the University of Wisconsin. She wrote an original and really great book entitled Politics of the Marketplace, Work, Gender, and Citizenship in Revolutionary France. So she's a great person to do our comment. Come on up, Katie.
Thank you. Okay. So many thanks to Bob, Tom, and Victoria for sharing your thought-provoking work, and to Suzanne for corralling us. If there's any through line in our papers today, it is certainly that rumors themselves formed a through line of the early revolution. Dynamic rumors acted as the filling between bursts of legislative resolutions and revolutionary germination. Rumors were a source of collective agency and collaboration for those constructing the narratives, and rumors fueled both hope and fear. In contrast with the quick-moving events that usually mark out our early narratives in the capital, the timelines associated with many major rumors of 1789 were that months long. In this emphatically protracted mental space, interested parties continually sought to discover information and give it meaning. While Bob's Palais Royal writers reinterpreted the royal session over several days, Tom's foreign plots grew over several months, and Victoria's deputies reassessed popular violence over several weeks. I couldn't help but think that there is a work that remains to be written called Patientez-vous, Gathering Information in the Early Revolution. So in his paper, newspaper on the rumors following the royal session, Robert Blackman makes clear that in contrast to simply reporting events, revolutionary rumors rely on fabrication and embellishment to make the meaning of these events resonate in certain communities. Bob focuses on what happens to Necker's office on June 23, 1789, after the king sought to nullify the National Assembly and ordered the estates to work separately. Bob notes that narratives coming out of the Palais Royal diverge from other reports, and he examines 6 accounts from the revolutionary hotbed to ask how and why different rumors developed there. The Palais Royal accounts attribute Necker's fate to the actions of the people. The crowd makes royal soldiers lay down their arms, and by extension, the crowd compels the king and the queen to keep Necker in his post, and even to retract earlier instructions from the royal session in a few accounts. The Palais Royal rumors emphasize that the people had made the king change course on June 23rd, and this gave Parisians hope that they could force the king's hand again on July 14th. And Bob points to the sequential development to argue that rumors create narratives of cause and effect that then become the presumed working mechanisms for future events. So to productively play devil's advocate right off the bat, at the start of Bob's paper, he gave us an account of June 23rd, from which the Palais Royal rumors diverged. And for his sources here, he cites works by deputies Pierre-Paul Narac and the Abbé Emmanuel Barboton. So Narac, if you can see his footnotes, writes testimony in a journal, but journals, like rumors, are written as a narrative to make sense, to give meaning to events. And Barboton writes his account in the form of letters, but also letters in Palais Royal spread the rumors of the day. So my first question for Bob is this: if rumors are packaging and delivering events for certain audiences, how do historians know who has somewhat reliable facts? Here I'm even thinking of how police commissaires try to please their superiors in reporting their observations of daily events, so even bureaucratic things have these overtones. So is all history essentially a history of rumors? No pressure to answer this. Not tonight.
You're giving away my whole book.
And second, if you could ignore that you already answered this about 20 minutes ago, are there any images of the day? Images, whether produced as prints for individual sale or use in periodicals, clearly have an intended audience, but without the discursive tools of narration. Can they contribute to the production of a new interpretation of their own? Or can they only reinforce rumors that have been already articulated in some kind of narrative form? Finally, Bob notes that rumors are often rooted in fear, but they may also be sources of hope. I'm an optimistic person, so what other hopeful rumors do you discern in the resolution? Thomas Kaiser turns our attention to the intersection of diplomatic and cultural history as he analyzes rumors and foreign plots in the summer of 1789. And Tom convincingly argues there was a growing concern over foreign affairs among much of the French population, and that these fears motivated mass and individual action during the summer and fall of 1789. Citizens variously blamed foreign agents, generic brigands, and foreign regiments within the Royal Army for plotting against Parisians and for leading the king astray. And Tom analyzes in particular detail the controversy surrounding the black and white cockades, which served as threatening visual reminders of international military alliances and internal plots against the nation. He shows how, in the wake of the rumored banquet orgy at Versailles on October 1st, some people feared that concerns over foreign loyalties might actually slip into civil war. Tom points out that since newspapers like Révolution de Paris and Courrier de Versailles spread rumors surrounding the October 1 banquet, he says, quote, "It is fair to guess that more than quashing rumors and discrediting information, the explosion of print media gave them a new lease on life and wider circulation. The Assembly even established its own committee de recherche to gather information on these supposed conspiracies and to inform its own decisions. So people's preoccupation with foreign affairs and influence, Tom argues, deeply colored their interpretation of revolutionary events at home and deserves more attention in its own right." So for Tom, I'd like to ask how we might prove this significant shift in people's attention to foreign affairs as kind of a sustained thematic preoccupation that surpassed individual rumors. So in keeping with your own point about print culture, is there a difference pre- and post-1789 to the amount of mainstream newspaper space dedicated to foreign affairs? So for example, there are official sections dedicated to reporting foreign news in the Moniteur during the Revolution. Could we compare both emphasis and length in pre-revolutionary journals? I'm also curious if the percentage of pamphlets including foreign topics increased from the pre-revolutionary period. Perhaps we could test these waters by scanning printers' publication lists for obvious foreign connections in the titles they sold. And then the foreign regiments in the King's Army, wow, they provide their own conceptual minefield for these issues. So as we know, there are 45,000 foreign troops in the standing royal military forces before the revolution. So in addition to the recent conflicts with Parliament, do we have a sense of when these troops drew commentary earlier in the century, where there's suspicious of them when the French fought German powers in the War of Austrian Succession and the 7 Years' War? And finally, just a suggestion for future thought. As Tom develops this issue of the cockade during the October days, it might be worth incorporating parallel foreign themes that are expressed in oath-taking at the same time and guarding the king's person. The first group of women to reach the Bastille in front of Versailles on October 5th made the Swiss troops and the chasseurs de Trois Évêchés take the oath of loyalty to the nation, and then later that evening, Lafayette advised the king to distance the Flanders regiment from Versailles and wanted the National Guard guard the king in addition to the bodyguards whose loyalties are suspect. So all of these actions also seem to check foreign plots and support your argument about the importance of these rumors to understanding the course of the early revolution. In her paper, Victoria Thompson deepens our understanding of the relationship between Parisians and the National Assembly out of Versailles by asking when and how the deputies used the rhetoric of popular violence in their own legislative debates. In doing so, Victoria establishes 3 important phases. First, during the summer of 1789, most deputies assumed that the king's misguided show of force in amassing troops around the capital cornered Parisians and encouraged them to violently repel injustices. And the deputies inherited this framework, she says, of self-defense from the king's pre-revolutionary showdowns with Parliament, in which his amassing of troops was deemed despotic. Then, into the early fall, the deputies remained largely hopeful that if only the people understood their work on their behalf, Parisians would not feel so desperate. The October days, however, opened a second phase in which, as Victoria puts it, rumors of violence entered the assembly. Rumors of violence against the assembly entered the political debates. After the deputies directly interacted with Parisians during the journée and continued to interact with them via delegations or personal trips to the capital, Victoria notes that the fears over the deputies' personal safety and their ability to speak freely entered the assembly's processus verbal. At the same time, the assembly started debating whether or not the assembly should emit passports to frightened members. And then on October 10th, the day the commune assured the deputies that they would be safe in Paris, the assembly moves into a 3rd phase in which the deputies started to reference their shared courage as a unifying force against rumored threats. This continued once the assembly also relocated actually to Paris and passed martial law. Victoria closes by hinting that the assembly's moved from the parish palace of Notre to the Ménage à Trois Deputies on November 9th, then opens up a new chapter in the deputies' concerns regarding rumors of capital and popular violence. So for Victoria, my main questions concern how the National Assembly's relationship to public force colors interpretations of popular violence. So before the October days, in Victoria's analysis, the National Assembly seems to assume that the king holds the power to use public force, yet after the October days, the deputies seem to claim that the use of public force for public order falls under their purview during martial law legislation. So is this sharp pivot not only the result of their interaction with the Parisian crowd during and after the October days, but also of their simultaneous face-to-face encounter with thousands of National Guards from Paris and Versailles? Do the deputies really realize very crisply that they're stuck powerless between royal troops and municipally directed National Guard units? Finally, Victoria analyzes the tenor of correspondence between the commune and the National Assembly as the deputies prepared to first move to Paris and then pass martial law. I'd like to know if Victoria sees this as kind of the first administrative calibration of fear between the National Assembly and the commune. As a point of contrast, when the Assemblée Générale des Électeurs de Paris turns into the permanent municipal government earlier in July, they first divide all the posts among police, finance, subsistence, military operations, defense of the city, internal order, and public safety. So based on the commune's list of governmental concerns, one would think it's already 1793. But the Assembly, in contrast, seems much less panicked at that moment in your analysis. And I was wondering if this is because, while the Assembly discusses popular violence in July, it hasn't yet charged itself with actually keeping order. So in sum, all of our panelists have emphasized that revolutionary groups develop rumors to compensate for a lack of timely information, and perhaps more importantly, to create blueprints for future action. Through the lens of neighborhood narratives, foreign plots, and legislative rhetoric, they have broadened our understanding of how rumors influence the course of the early revolution.
Panelists, do you want to respond, or do you just want to open for questions? Yeah, let's just open
difference between right and left in how these things work out. First, most of the accounts of what happened on June 23rd seem to be coming from a pro-revolutionary side. And the question of the Austrians seems extremely important to me. And it relates very much to the Declaration, which only, of course, comes in April of 1792, and comes from the Girondins, is largely fueled by the Girondins. The question is this the group that most believes? And one of the reasons they do it is they are convinced there's going to be an invasion, and they're going to stop the invasion. So it's in a sense a sort of centered left reaction to the rumors. And then finally, in the National Assembly, that Victoria is talking about, the fact is that the violence that's occurring in the period that you're talking about is largely against the right-wing deputies. So Mirabeau is kind of saying, look, you people should stop being so upset about this, because I think they're extremely, then they realize, well, if all of the right-wing deputies leave and go home, there's going to be a big problem. So then it becomes a more general problem. But the real threats, as I understand it, are really against the right-wing deputies. They're actually being, in some cases, attacked in the street. So there does seem to be a kind of right-left dynamic in what is happening.
Well, there are more right-wing sources, but they're not coming from the Palais Royal. So there are different streams of rumor that are coming about these events. I really only looked at one of this. There's another one that's coming from deputies that I tend to typify as the heroic deputy version, where they leave out the part where the crowd pushed them down. It's definitely the deputies' resolute action. But later we start seeing more conservative figures, including courtiers and even deputies, who leave blame Necker. They tend to blame him as trying to ride the crowd and his own popularity. So that's a very different stream of rumor. I'm holding hands with one at a time. So that's
Just very quickly, there's been a long critique of the Austrian alliance ever since 1756, most of it directed by the anti-Choiseul, anti-Pompadour faction. Marie Antoinette is seen as an extension of that faction, so she becomes the beneficiary of all of those critiques. Right? It is, I do think in 1789 there was a gradual appropriation of the left, whatever exactly we mean by that, of that discourse. And it's done through several important people like Jarvis, for example, a diplomat named Kaiser, who writes a very influential book, which was published just about this time, which traces all of France's problems back to the Austrian alliance. And he winds up into the Jacobin. So there's a kind of a popularization and maybe a displacement of that rhetoric, that argument towards the left in the course of this period. That goes beyond my paper, but that's my
Thank you, Lynn. So I think, yes, you're absolutely right. And just a couple of observations that I thought were interesting is that members that are more on the right, and especially the clergy that are truly more in danger, are use these rumors of violence to try and convince the others in the assembly that it's a threat to the whole. So it's kind of like I'm focused on the Mirabeau and others saying, well, we all have to be brave, but there's this counter attempt to kind of create common identity, like we're all under threat, we all have to protect each other, which is really interesting. And then, as I ended, it kind of seems like there's this agreement, and then, Timothy Tack has talked about how deputies do feel safer in the beginning. They start to come back to the assembly, it starts to be more robust, but then they immediately begin debating the property of the clergy. And so it's like these divisions that, those kind of seem to be papered over, and then it opens up again. And what I'm thinking, a lot more research to do, is that the move to the manège is going to exacerbate those divisions. So, thank you.
I feel like I have a nerve asking a question in a room full of revolutionaries.
What is that ever stop?
So I really love these papers, and what it, this is again a very broad question, is how rumors, the function of rumors dovetails with numerous revolutionary ideals, you know, kind of setting the boundaries, shaking up those boundaries. And the one I was thinking about is transparency and the relationship between rumor and transparency. I'm thinking about transparency not simply as visibility, but also accountability. And where does rumor fit in? Because one of the things about rumors is you never know the origins of those rumors. And so here we have this revolutionary dynamic at the same time as transparency seems to become something bigger and bigger. And, you know, I don't even know if that's a question, but
Social scientists are all over this. One of the things that defines a rumor is that you don't know who started it.
right.
And people refer to someone, and there are all kinds of different levels of it. They'll refer to a specific type of person. That's why I kind of discount the police commissioner as actually really having said it. The specific commissioner, in the original source, he says, and I was never able to find out his name. So there's that person of authority who you don't really know but has the authority. And then it gets down to the part where people just seem to be recounting facts, but they don't put themselves into it. They don't say, I saw this happen, or I was there. In fact, they talk about it, like Dave London. I was there earlier in the day, and then these things happen. So they're distancing themselves, and that's really an important part of the rumor. And I think that's part of what allows it to generate the spread, is that you always have that distancing from the rumor. So if you're wrong, it's not you who's making a mistake. It's always a step away from your own dignity when you're talking about these things. I don't know if that's an answer.
It's a big question, too, because it's the transparency side that I kind of, you know, it can work together, but I also think there are these inherent contradictions at play, too. You know?
Especially the kinds of rumors that are happening, they're basically plots, right? Conspiracy, right? So very rumors of a conspiracy, which is almost by definition something that's invisible or nearly invisible, and in the process of, and what you're trying to do is unpack that, it's trying to reveal what it truly is, right? Of course, what you find is it's an infinite regress, because one of these move released to the next. But I think you're right. I mean, there's transparency very much closely connected to this phenomenon.
And just very quickly, in the assembly, I think as well said, rumor is linked to power, who you believe. So it was really interesting when Maillard comes in on October 5th and makes his speech to the assembly. He starts by, you know, talking about this rumor against a very powerful person, and all the deputies are like, oh, no, this isn't true. And he has to drop that and then go to another issue. So, so I think, like, whether or not you think a rumor is transparent, whether it's truth or close to the truth, also depends on who's stating it. Good question.
Jeff?
This was a great panel. I'm really interested in what exactly is a rumor. You know, in this day of alternate facts, of hoaxes, of internet scams, of all of the different rhetorical strategies that we've evoked, what exactly does a rumor represent? And so listening to Bob and Victoria in particular, I was thinking a lot about Thomas Kuhn and wondering what makes a rumor be able to spread, or what makes people believe, or what gives it power, is that it reshapes the paradigm. And I wonder, I don't know whether that's a useful way of thinking about it, but that's really what I was thinking about as you were talking, is that you're really talking about something that reshapes the political culture, the moral economy, depending on how it's worked. I think it actually also works for the diplomatic stuff, is that they're trying to, undermine a paradigm shift, that had happened with the diplomatic revolution. So anyway, I don't know whether that's helpful, but I did think that the similarity of challenging paradigms was an intriguing part of your panel. Thank you.
William Sewell. He has that great article on what an event is.
Yeah.
And so he's right in that boat with you, trying to figure one thing becomes the official account of what happened on the 23rd, and how the other version just doesn't go away and persists and still turns up in historical accounts.
What I thought was interesting was when I was reading the work of sociologists trying to think about rumor, there are a number of different hypotheses that people have that all seem to be operating at this same really intense period in the French Revolution. So there's like your old ways of thinking about things aren't making sense of what's going on. There's a proliferation of the press, and the more means you have to spread rumors, the more they need. There's this like reconfiguration of who has power and who has influence. And so like all these things are happening at the same time. So it's just like so it actually was kind of interesting to me that rumors weren't, there were a couple of different periods where people talked about rumors of violence, but it was really interesting that they didn't make it their way kind of as a meaningful part of debates until the October days. That was kind of interesting.
So, building on this, I wonder, there are always rumors, right? Within every institution, even in our own departments or daily lives, everywhere. And what is it that at a certain moment a rumor takes on political force? What makes these rumors different from all the rumors people had heard forever about different parts of their lives? And can we take rumor as a category of historical analysis that is one of the causes of the French Revolution? Number 8, is that all? Does rumor have causal force? It sounds like you're saying it does.
The question is, supposing you believe it, supposing it's true, then what follows, right? What strategies are available to you? What can you fear from your enemies? What must you fear for your enemies? What can you hope to do to try to do it? So it's kind of the formation of a strategy, and I think that may be the way to look at it, looking at different actors and seeing what political strategies emerge from either believing a rumor or denying it. Right? It could go either way.
So there's a really important shading here, I think, psychologically, between believing a rumor and believing. So that rumor makes it more deniable in the future. You can say, well, I was hoaxed by this rumor. It was just a rumor, and I was going along with it, I wasn't sure. And it still allows you to distance yourself from it. And so you don't end up being a martyr, you end up being a victim. And so you can go to the court, you can go to a panel put together by the National Assembly after the October days and say, I had heard all these things and they had force on me, it's not my fault. Whereas if it's a profound belief, you have to go to jail for it.
Boy, we got a lot of questions. Yeah, go ahead.
I was thinking partly about what people have been saying about what rumors are and how they can have an agenda and be related to conspiracy. But at the most basic, remember this is a society where news and information is hard to get on the ground. And most of you have been more Paris-centered, except for your anecdotes about Normandy. But if you deal with the south of France, news doesn't get there till for about a week. And so, maybe my own work in 1814 and 1815, they don't know what's happening for a week. And so the rumors are spreading because everyone's thinking, hearing different things, and where those different things come from, lots of different people. It comes from fear, and it doesn't really necessarily always start as conspiracy. It starts as a lack of real news about what's going on, and particularly among peasant societies, the peasant part of France, where they really don't know, and they're really not reading the newspaper, and they're isolated in little villages. So you can think great fear, you can think of all these things.
And what do you take the truth from? What truth is authoritative for you may not be obviously authoritative for somebody else. So against what do you look? You've heard this rumor. Now what do you believe it or don't you believe it? Duquesne Noir's journal is very interesting about this. If you look at tracing during 1789, what he heard all these rumors as being a deputy. And he said, well, should I believe it? Shouldn't I believe it? Why should I believe it? I mean, it's actually quite good on that, on that particular matter.
unfortunately, we're actually out of time, so I'm
Is
sorry.
that true,